Why do the nations of the world hate Israel? How is the United States involved in that? How is prophecy connected to all of that? Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about today, and we're so glad that you've joined us on this edition of Your Turn. Well, we left off just before the break where we had established the historical, documented, verified through archaeology and other historical documents outside of the Bible. We had established that Israel came out of Egypt, or excuse me, let's just call them the Hebrews, the children of Israel, the children of Abraham, the children of Jacob, came out of Israel after some 400 years of captivity and bondage, came into the land of what we would now call Israel. The world calls it Palestine. We'll talk later about how it got that name. But they came into the land, crossed the Jordan, conquered Jericho, conquered Ai, conquered the land, settled it by the 12 tribes, and then for about 400 years ruled the land as a nation. Now, they didn't have kings, but they did have a system of leaders called judges. These were tribal leaders, and they did have a military. They had a united military among the various tribes. They fought many wars as they were attacked, and they held possession of the land as a people, well over 1 million strong. They held the land as a nation for 400 years. Folks, that's almost twice as long as the United States has been a nation. And as I said, prior to them entering the land, there were independent cities and or villages and or settlements. The place was settled by tribes of various peoples and various ethnicities, but there was no established nation in the land prior to Israel, nor has there ever been an established nation in that land other than Israel. So near the end then of that 400 years of being ruled by a system of judges, the last judge of Israel, if you will, would be the man by the name of Samuel. You read about him in the book of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament, and of course in other historical sources. But Samuel would be the one that God would use to direct and anoint the first two kings of Israel, King Saul and King David. Let's talk about that for a moment. So you have this nation of people settled according to their 12 tribes, with a united military, holding a united border, holding a united nation together for 400 years, twice as long as the United States. At the end of that 400 years, they further established themselves as a bona fide nation through a system of kings and a government with palaces, with further extended borders, eventually coining money and engaging in trade and international affairs. So at the end of the 400 years, the first king that is appointed among the Israeli people, the Hebrew people in the land of Israel, the first king is King Saul. This is recorded in history. Of course, the Bible records it. But we know this. We know this as a fact. They had a king and a mighty nation. Millions of people with borders and a united military. And so King Saul reigned over Israel. Now, this is where it becomes fascinating. After King Saul's reign, of course, King David comes to the throne, probably one of the most famous kings among the nations in the world in all of history. And so for these naysayers that say that Israel never was a nation, Israel has no claim to the land, then explain King David. Explain 400 years of the nation of Israel existing even before King David came to power and came to rule as the king of Israel. And it was King David during his reign that would establish Jerusalem as the capital of his kingdom. And it was King David who would arrange for the returning of the ark, which had been captured some several decades prior to that by the Philistines, and then eventually returned and kept in safekeeping by some Levites out in the countryside. But it was King David that would take that ark and would arrange for its return to Jerusalem, or its bringing into Jerusalem. It never was in Jerusalem, but so it wasn't returned to Jerusalem, but it was brought into Jerusalem. And then the tabernacle, which had been at Shiloh, which had been destroyed by the Philistines a couple of decades before, was now reconstructed and rebuilt in Jerusalem. The ark was placed in the tabernacle. the Levitical priestly line of daily sacrifices was reestablished by King David. Now there is a nation with its second king, with a capital in Jerusalem, the center of worship, the center of the military, the center of the economy, Jerusalem with King David. Now, one of King David's deepest desires was to establish Jerusalem as the center of worship, and he did do that. In fact, he's the one that made that happen. But one of his deepest desires was that he would be the one to build a temple, a constructed stone temple, rather than the tent-like tabernacle that was in Jerusalem and that had been in the wilderness for those 40 years with the Israelites, and then established for hundreds of years at Shiloh. But it was his deepest desire to build a temple in Jerusalem. Now, the Bible tells us that God made it very clear to David's heart that he was not the one to do it, but it would be one of his sons who would come after him. And sure enough, the Bible records, and history records, and archaeological discoveries verify that David's son Solomon, King Solomon, was the one who would eventually build the temple in Jerusalem. Solomon came to power after King David's death. Solomon, of course, another world-famous king. Who has not heard of King Solomon and his riches and his wisdom and his power and the mighty the mighty kingdom that he established, and the temple, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world? It was built by the Palestinians? No. The Arabs? No. The Muslims? No. It was built by King Solomon. The Temple Mount, which is there today, are the ruins of, or what's left of, the remnants of Solomon's temple. The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem this day is the uncovered, excavated part of the Temple Mount. And many of the stones that are there, archaeologists believe, and the Jews believe, are the original stones laid by the builders of Solomon in the original temple which sat upon that site. Of course, now the Muslim Dome of the Rock is there, and we'll talk about all of that in a moment and how it got there. But King Solomon of Israel, of the Hebrews, after already hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years being established as a nation with judges and rulers and a military, now Solomon is the 3rd king in line behind Saul and David. Now a temple is built, and Israel is the only nation to have ever occupied that land. Now, one of the saddest chapters in Israel's national history was the death of King Solomon, because it was at his death and at his going out that various people of the land, including some of his military leaders and some of his own sons, began to jockey around for the power void that would be left, and certain factions were following certain people and leaders of Israel, and there was a civil war in Israel. The Bible records this. History records this. Oddly enough, the Civil War was between the North and the South. That's right. It's amazing how Israel's history, or how America's history, mirrors Israel's history in so many fascinating ways. We'll talk more about that in a moment as well. But for right now, we want to emphasize that it was King Solomon, after King Solomon, when Israel's civil war occurred, and when the nation was divided into the 2 kingdoms. And it was with that division that the northern territory, or the northern kingdom, known as Israel, was established, with its capital at Samaria. And of course, then at the same time, the southern kingdom was established. It was known as Judah, and its capital was at Jerusalem. Now, for several hundred years more, these 2 parts of this nation would exist. Again, they were Hebrews, run by Hebrews, with Hebrew kings, kings of the northern kingdom, kings of the southern kingdom, kings of Israel, kings of Judah. These were not Palestinians, these were not Arabs. It was the nation of Israel, albeit a divided nation, but it was still the nation of Israel and the Hebrew people who had established themselves for hundreds and multiplied hundreds of years as a bona fide nation. Now, what history records is that the Assyrian Empire was now on the rise as one of the world's up-and-coming superpowers. To make it a little easier to imagine this in your mind, if you're not too familiar with geography and history and maps, the Assyrian Empire would roughly encompass what is modern-day Iran, with a little bit of modern-day Iraq and some of the surrounding nations. But let's just say the Assyrian Empire would be roughly equivalent to modern-day Iran. And during the time of the divided kingdom of Israel, the Assyrian Empire arises as the world's superpower. Now, the rulers and the leaders of the Assyrian Empire begin to eye that little piece of property on the Mediterranean, which has been so valuable and so lusted after for so long by so many, known as Israel. And the Assyrian leaders saw that Israel, the Hebrews, this nation of Israel, was now weakened because of its civil war. Because it was now, for all practical purposes, divided into two kingdoms of Hebrews, two nations of Israel, if you will, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the rulers of the Assyrian Empire saw this and decided to capitalize on it. And so attack after attack was launched against the northern kingdom until finally the northern kingdom succumbed and fell. Now, there's a whole lot that goes into this, a lot of political intrigue and history, and I'm not going to bore you with all the details. I'm just getting to the point here that the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrian Empire and was swallowed up in that. Now, it so happens that out of the 12 tribes that settled the land, roughly 10 of them made up this northern kingdom, and so these 10 tribes were taken off into captivity, if you will, taken off into the land of Assyria, swallowed up and assimilated by the Assyrian culture for many, many, many decades. And sometimes these are referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because they intermixed and intermarried and intermingled with the Assyrians and all of the other people that the Assyrians had conquered. And when some of those people finally did come back to the land, they were not true Hebrews anymore. But the Assyrians conquered the northern empire. They made several attempts to conquer the southern empire, and the Bible records and history records that they were unable to do so. So the southern empire held pretty much intact, and they were a nation with their own kings for decades and decades that followed, with the nation called Judah and its capital at Jerusalem. Now, some years later, the next world empire, the next superpower that would arise on the world scene would be the nation or the empire of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire would be roughly equivalent to modern-day Iraq. Along the Tigris-Euphrates River and Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Who hasn't heard these from world history? And so what does world history record? That Nebuchadnezzar, like the Assyrian leaders, looked down at that stretch of land. Why is that stretch of land? Why is that little piece of land so valuable? Well, it's valuable because it's a natural land bridge between three continents. Israel connects Europe, Asia, and Africa. Plus, it's beautifully fertile, rich in natural resources. It's been said that the only real natural resource that they do not possess is oil products. But even now, as I'm doing this radio show, it's in the national news that oil is being discovered in Israel and natural gas reserves are being discovered in Israel. It's an amazing, amazing land, coveted for hundreds of years by many nations of the world. And so Nebuchadnezzar sees this land. He sets it in his heart to attack Judah with its capital at Jerusalem. What do we know from world history? Well, we know that eventually Nebuchadnezzar was successful. Nebuchadnezzar came in, destroyed the city, leveled the city, leveled the temple that Solomon had built, literally leveled it to the ground, and destroyed the Temple Mount, and took the remaining tribes of Israel into captivity in Babylon, and thus closes a sad chapter in Israel's history. Israel really existed no more after that. until 1948. But there's a whole lot more that happens. Stay tuned on the other side of the break.